I already had like a concept of this idea back in 2023 to 2024. But they already were more just designs based off of like basic ideas of the art movements. And like when I say like basic ideas, I mean like a nice skim off of Google Images and Pinterest and Wikipedia. But now like a solid year later, I went back in with a bit more research and then combining them to make a more like thoroughly designed and interesting looking character. Because in my opinion, I don't think their old designs do the art movements I picked justice. And just to get you up to speed, the art movements I chose back then were Baroque, Cubism, both synthetic and analytic. I'll get into those later. Soviet constructivism, pop art, ukiyo-e, and surrealism. I think there were some others that I had my mind on, but these six were the ones that caught my attention the most and seemed the easiest to make designs for. The character I designed was the 17th to 18th century art movement called Baroque, I think that's how you say it, which derived from many places. The word, I mean. It's either from the French word baroque, which meant something irregular or innate, or the Italian word barocco, which meant something that is an obstacle, a schematic, or / basic logic. But in art criticism, the term is used to describe anything that derailed from the status quo of the Renaissance era, which is usually tackle taboo and macabre topics and just stuff in general they considered degenerate, which is a very harsh term for something to describe art. Seems very fascistic, in my opinion. I had a pretty coherent design in my mind when I discovered this specific style of art after I went to, look at the kind of paintings and architecture that fell in the category of Baroque. You can tell from its paintings and architecture that it's one of the unique styles that came from the Renaissance era. You can remark its distinctiveness from its way of showing lighting by using harsh contrast of color and shadows, but also how it depicts subject matter with large focus on the theatrical, classical, and the religious. Especially the religious, I'll get to that later, where everything's intensely dramatic and flowy with emotion. And as you'll learn, this was obviously intentional. So when designing Baroque, I decided to add a lot of contrasting shadows to her design to mimic the style of paintings. And then for her clothing, I actually derived that from Baroque architecture and 16th century bourgeoisie fashion, like the ruffled collar, the large crinoline dress, and even the feathered hat. In her original design, she wore kind of the basic tunic with a Baroque-style pattern lace at the bottom, but I changed it into a large crinoline dress because I wanted her to look specifically like a Catholic church. The reason for that was because Baroque was specifically made by Catholics in protest of the Protestant Reformation, which is basically a rival faction of Catholicism in Christianity, I think, and they felt the need to re-establish the significance of Catholicism in Europe because of that. And that's why paintings and architecture emphasize the feeling of a religious fervor and try to appeal to the faithful, or anyone considering Catholicism, basically. And back in Europe, it was basically a sin not to be a Catholic. In churches, you would often see a large dome or cupola above the building to represent the heavens looking down upon the Catholics as they pray. They really like emphasizing size and the largeness of like infinity, as some of them called it. Since this was the era of discovery where Europe began, coming across other countries and continents and finding out that the world is much bigger than they thought, and also looting them and enslaving their population. Anyway, so that's why I chose to enlarge her dress to represent Baroque's obsession with exuberance and richness, and the little folds reaching out of her dress, were made to imitate windows of a church. I tried to frame the drawing as dramatic as I can. I even added the red curtain that a lot of Baroque portraits have to add some movement and make it feel more dramatic. But because her dress and her form in general is just so big, it really hindered her movements. So it's not as flowy as I would have liked it. But I will say, I do like her design compared to her old one. I do believe it represents the art movement way more. I think she just looks more bigger. She kind of looks like a last boss in a RPG game. Maybe. She's like a statue, but then she comes alive and she attacks you. And health bar just shows up on the top of the screen. And then the next art movement I decided to design is called ukiyo-e, I think that's how you say it. Which is a Japanese art form that started gaining attention during the Edo period, which is the Japanese term for the era between 1600s to the 1850s. and it was largely popular overseas in Europe and other nations after Japan opened borders to the world in order for its international markets, I guess. Based on my sort of limited research and my lack of Japanese skills, the uki in ukiyo seems to mean sadness, and the yo in ukiyo means life. And it's the reference in the Buddhist concept of the cycle of life, death, suffering, and then rebirth. But uki also seems to mean to float, which in the Edo period kind of meant like wafting through Earth's pleasures like a cloud. And so that's why ukiyo-e is also called the art of the floating world. Based on my research, I can't confirm that like totally. I'm not Japanese, so. And for further context, during the Edo period, the Japanese economy began to prosper greatly because of its opening markets. It was considered the golden age of Japanese art and culture, with a lot of ukiyo-e woodwork prints being sold to the prospering merchant class. This explained why a lot of ukiyo-e prints depicted entertainment actors like kabuki actors, because the kabuki theater started to develop during this period, as well as geishas and even erotica. But ukiyo-e also depicted animals and plants. One famous example is from the infamous ukiyo-e painting The Wave by Shika Hakusai, and also a lot of prints took inspiration from folklore and history, specifically Japanese folklore and history, but I think other Asian folklore and history too. Using all this information, I depicted ukiyo-e as a male kabuki actor dressed in feminine clothing, something similar to a geisha or even a maiko, which is like a geisha in training. Since kabuki actors were usually male and they played both male and female roles. At least during the early years of the period, since even though the Edo period, saw some great advancements in society, it also had a lot of strict hierarchies, so. But to make his appearance a bit more theatrical and interesting, I decided to mix in natural elements to his clothing to make it more appealing. Like I said, ukiyo-e technically translates somewhat into the art of the floating world. So I wanted his clothing to not only drape across his body to give a good sense of movement, but also imitate the way painters in the area depicted different aspects of flowing movement, like smoke, clouds, and water. In my original design, his elemental aspects were more rigid and stiff, and also his clothes were a bit inaccurate to the era and culture of, Japanese kimonos, and I think he even has some, Shinto priest in his design, but it's not totally accurate, I don't think. I think I was just putting in whatever I thought looked good from different aspects of Japanese culture, but here I decided to just go off of the pictures of women, and specifically geishas and maikos I saw depicted in ukiyo-e, which is usually with an umbrella, I think they're called like a wagasa, loose kimonos and robes, and then some gold hair accessories, instead of adding anything, unnecessary. They always seem to be looking over their shoulders, maybe paying heed to the erotica ukiyo-e sometimes produced, but also to showcase the textile patterns on the robes. I do like how the end of his robe trails off into a body of water and the branches from his hair turn to leaves, but I do think it's a bit inconvenient if an actual person were to wear something like this. It just seemed like it'd take a while to take off and move around and, But other than that, I like the simplicity of ukiyo-e's design way more, and I think does the art movement a good service, at least for me, personally. But there he is. Next is constructivism, and maybe more specifically, Soviet constructivism, since I took inspiration largely from its history with the Soviet Union, but I believe other countries took the concept and made their own thing too. I don't have a large problem with their old design, but there's definitely more interesting things I could have taken, so that's what I'll do now. And if you look at constructivism, you could probably tell it resembles a lot of typical propaganda posters you see in Soviet nations. But I believe that's more socialist realism than constructivism. But constructivism is older than the Stalinist regime, so it's a different kind of style. But this kind of style was specifically developed in Soviet Russia during the 1920s after the Bolsheviks won over the Russian monarchy and formed the Soviet Union. It was designed to be an art with a function, to use abstract art to encourage a progressive era of the newly founded communist regime and promote industry and modernity. And that's why for a pose, I made her pose lean upward with her hands reaching up to the sky to represent the Soviet ideal of progression and revolution. For her design, because constructivism took a lot of inspiration from modern and abstract art, I tried to give her clothing and even her hair a distinct shape. For clothing, obviously, I took inspiration from Soviet officers and like Bolshevik soldiers during the Russian Civil War to emphasize her communist sympathies, but the patterns on her clothing was inspired by the constructivist fashion designer Vavada Stebnova, whose clothing emphasized strong angles and dynamic shapes, which is common in constructivist art. But honestly, trying to find a good shape pattern was really difficult, and it really stumped me because I'm not a fashion designer, so just placing different shapes into a coherent pattern is pretty difficult for me. But then I decided to make a rule for myself to have all the shapes always tilt upward, because if the pose is reaching up to represent progression, directions of the angles should direct up too. That's what I thought. I also wanted her color scheme to be predominantly white and red, because during the Civil War, the Bolsheviks would be represented as red, and the people with sympathies to the monarchy would be white. And in constructivist posters, there would be imagery of red piercing against a white background to represent communist victory over the bourgeoisie. But eventually black started overwhelming her design instead. So for some reason, I didn't like how white looked on her, but I did manage to add some in her hair and some other places like the outline of her clothing. But red overwhelms her design more and kind of devalues my original intent to represent communist victory, which I suppose, it isn't the worst thing ever, you know? Like, she'd probably really be happy about that. But anyways, for her hair, I saw these pictures on Twitter and Pinterest of the main character from Land of the Illustrious. I don't remember their name. A lot of artists do a lot of like interesting ways of depicting their hair, and they reminded me of like the stark and strong shapes you see in posters, where it helps direct the viewer to wherever the painter wanted them to look at. So I use that as inspiration to design her hair and help it emphasize the abstract and modernity of her design. I also kept the large bows on her neck because I thought it was a good, distinct, and sharp shape on her silhouette. I also wanted to add some like constructivist sculptures to her design, but I didn't have any space. One of the reasons being I made her form too close to the camera, and so I wanted to add something to the background, but it just cluttered the drawing, and I had to go for something simpler. I know I wanted it to look like a poster, but her design in itself is pretty much like a Soviet poster, so I just let her design do all the talking. I also wanted to add the Tower of Babel by Vladimir Tadlin because I thought it was a really cool sculpture and also helped emphasize the theme of progress and revolution in my drawing. But in the end, I had to side rail it to make way for her character design. I think that was the best decision because I tried to add it on my first attempt and I didn't like it. I thought it cluttered the drawing like crazy. I think the second attempt is definitely better, even if I had to get rid of some, original ideas. And there's some more I want to say about this art movement, but I didn't think it was relevant to her design process, so maybe I'll add like footnotes in the description. I don't know. But that's her. Little Miss Constructivism. It's hard to say. And then next is pop art, which is an art movement I believe is the most popular out of the 6, maybe less than another one, but since it's so accessible and has been commercialized to like high heaven. But obviously, that's fine, since that's the intention of the art movement, to make art accessible to a wider audience and push back against elitist notions of what an artist is and is supposed to be. I remember I thought her old design didn't represent pop art enough because it was difficult to figure out what she was wearing and why she was wearing it. I believe I was trying to imitate like a sci-fi comic character, something like Star Trek or those like older Japanese vintage space girl shows. Not exactly like Sailor Moon, but those kind of outfits you kind of see on Pinterest. You can probably see in her old design, but she took some inspiration from Harajuku fashion too, since I thought it seemed to take some inspiration from pop art with its maximalistic details and bright colors. Sadly, I did change this, but I didn't get rid of her bright colors, so there's one W for Harajuku fashion. Also, I just didn't understand pop art enough back then. I thought it was just like a comic book page on a portrait, and people thought it was art. Obviously, I was wrong, and now I have a better grasp of what pop art is and what it was trying to do when it was starting out. So first off, to establish a better understanding of what she would wear, I decided to roll with a theme of a quote-unquote bobby soxer, which I believe is a British term for like a girly girl or like a girly schoolgirl. And I got this inspiration after I read a book about pop art, and an art critic that I don't remember the name of, when pop art was like just starting out, and it was like posted at an exhibition that I also don't remember the name of, and he called it something along the lines of like art for bobby soxers, and then something like, oh, what kind of art is this? I specifically use the British term because pop art actually originated in Britain and not America. But however, pop art was heavily influenced by American culture. Because at this point during the 50s, the British had been wrecked by the Second World War and turned to the rise of American consumerism to lift their spirits. And that's pretty much one of the main components of pop art, which is consumerism and pop culture. That's why it's called pop art. Things like television were starting to be in like every middle-class family home, and because of that, there grew like a looming rise of advertisements and entertainment, and easier access to news around the world. That's why pop art has an overall appearance of the typical like 60s girl, because the 60s specifically was the era of popular culture, with the teal and saturated colors of the vintage advertisements and even her large like Miku like pigtails that I wanted to resemble party confetti. Has the dotted texture of like comics to pay homage to the pop artist Roy Lichtenstein, who usually created art from comic books. The modernist patterns on her skirt also kind of resemble comic panels, and the rainbows on the design might be a stretch, but they were supposed to represent the rise of television with color and just, the overabundance of color during the 60s, as they were, trying to move on from the Second World War. The reason she's actually holding a microphone is because even though pop art was an ally to, to consumerism and advertisement and the rising capitalist empire, pop art was also used for political awareness and sending a message about the modern world. The 60s were notoriously a political era, and painters wanted to bring awareness to everything happening around them. An example is Andy Warhol's repetition paintings that seem to be like a commentary of mass media's deadening impact, with fear that the relentless showcase of war and genocide in advertisements will null our senses of actual danger and joy of the real world. Keith Haring was also a famous pop artist who made art about the AIDS crisis, in which he eventually became a victim of. An artist in China used pop art and mixed it with socialist realism to make commentary about the political state of their economy, and that eventually became something called political pop. So that's why pop art is really bright, but she's also really loud. That could also be the reason why she carries the megaphone around. She wants everyone to know her because she believes everyone deserves to know what she's thinking, and because, pop art was made for everyone, using materials and topics known and used by the society at large. Particularly if you had like a telephone or a radio, but also maybe the newspapers. It really opens my mind to what pop art is now, compared to, last year, when I just thought it was just put a sticky on like a comic book and they're done. Pop art is way more than that, and I appreciate that now. Alright, now my second final design is Cubism, and honestly, I actually liked his old design. I thought it utilized what Cubism is, and that is creating a painting through geometric shapes and unconventional perspective points. So honestly, his redraw is less of a redesign and more of a repainting of the original, trying to give him another angle, focus more on his face, stuff like that. But yeah, I thought he was perfect. My perfect little boy. But I might as well go through his character process anyway, since, we're here. And so, Cubism. Woohoo! Cubism origins can be traced back to two men, which is Pablo Picasso and George Braque. They pretty much worked together to create this style based off a painter named Paul Cézanne, an African mask they owned because, white people liked to own them back then because they thought they were, like, exotic and otherworldly. But Picasso and Braque specifically used African masks as a reference to Cubism because people thought African art contrasted heavily with, the contemporary view of what art is, or was at least, and it challenged the conventional white standards of beauty. Basically, they thought African art was more, concerned with what they knew instead of what they saw, and that's what the two artists used as reference for Cubism. Based on Studio Binder's description of Cubism, because I'm lazy, Cubism was a means of discovering a subject's true essence rather than judging them by surface-level perspectives. The Cubism art movement apparently had two kinds of phrases, which are analytic and synthetic. I'm still a bit confused of what the difference is, but I can put two examples of both on the screen if it'll be more helpful. Basically, analytic cubism is said to be trying to depict a thing from many angles at once, and synthetic cubism builds up a picture from a combination of abstract signs and visual elements. Something similar to a collage, which the Cubism movement had a relative hand in influencing. At least the modern term of collaging in art, I believe. Don't quote me on that, honestly, but collaging was pretty important to Cubism, is basically what I'm trying to say. I try to put some aspects of both phrases into the drawing by having some lines intersect to form the character of Cubism. It gives the illusion that the lines just happen to create his figure instead of seeming intentional. I thought it might be close to how artists made their analytic cubit paintings. They might be stretched for synthetic cubism, but I wanted each body part to seem as if they were put together like Frankenstein.
kind of imitating the collage style in synthetic cubism. I think that's the best explanation I have. He does seem like a complex collage of some kind. And you could probably tell, but he was heavily influenced by the character Enna by Joel G on YouTube, and also from his game Dream Barbecue. Both pieces of media that I absolutely adore, and are definitely influences to why I began the series of art movements as characters in the first place. The blue and yellow color palette is also a huge giveaway, but also a common color scheme during the early 20th century in my opinion, I think. Enna herself seems to have a lot of Cubism influences, and I looked it up, and she is based off of a Picasso painting, but also the work of Romero Brito, who's a Brazilian cubist and pop artist. So she is heavily influenced by Cubism. So shout out to Enna, created by Joel G. And now we have our final design, another 20th century art movement, and a pretty popular one, which is Surrealism. So like Cubism, I thought his design was fine, but I was a bit worried there was more to Surrealism that I was missing, since Surrealism is a pretty personal kind of art movement, where each painter, has a very specific example of what they believe Surrealism is to them. And what I mean by that is Surrealism is influenced by Sigmund Freud's psychological theory about people and their dreams, and about how a person's dreams are their subconscious hidden thoughts, which I'm pretty sure has some merit of scientific truth, I'm pretty sure. Andre Breton, I think that's how you say his name, was a major pioneer of the movement, believed that dreams were a route to understanding a person's unconscious thoughts, and so his idea of surrealism was to unite it in the form of writing, music, painting, or just any form of art to bring your unconsciousness into reality. Hopefully that makes sense. And so basically I thought everyone's dreams or unconscious thoughts are all different because we all have differing meanings to what things are. So how can I make that into a character if there's no universal, definite symbol to anything? Surrealism is interesting because one surrealist doesn't look like another, or doesn't draw or make art like another. Obviously, you can say that about like any art movement, but if you look at the other characters, the style and the dominant trait of each movement kind of, sorts of unites it. Kind of like wearing the same jersey of your team, but each member doesn't play the game the same way. Maybe that doesn't make any sense, but the point is, Surrealism was a more difficult character design out of all the other art movements. So I decided to try to focus on what Surrealism is and why it exists. And I came to a few conclusions after reading some books I used as reference. And so basically, these are the notes I got from it. So kind of the basic of what Surrealism is about isolation, one's consciousness, mysteriousness and strangeness, the extraordinary and the inexplicable, secrecy, violence, and desire. I know these may sound like a bit random, but I'll just explain further to give you the better idea of what I wanted to do. Starting with his head, Surrealism's old design had his head as a clock, encased within like a jar of some kind. I don't really remember why he was a clock other than it was like a common symbol Surrealist artists used. But instead for his redesign, I made his head a vanity or like a mirror of some kind. Because Surrealist art at its core to me is a reflection of the soul. So when one looks at him, they're looking at themselves because what he is what you define him as. Pretty deep, right? And the reason why it's encased in this elaborately, styled jar is because I kind of thought it as like a display jar for something like a trinket or a jar you put like a butterfly or some exotic animal inside. Like a small exotic creature. I mean, you can't fit an alligator in it, obviously. It's to emphasize the idea that the act of trying to put meaning on something is a form of art, and that Surrealist art puts one's own thoughts and inner desires on display for people to see. As for the rest of his body, I kept his cupboard legs because I remember they were based off of the painting of The Burning Giraffe and the anamorphic cabinet by Salvador Dali, who was a popular Surrealist artist, where he depicted cabinet drawers in random, strange scenarios. From some articles I've seen, it seems to reference Freud's idea of drawers and shelves being a representation of the human psyche, and how these drawers of our minds can be opened through psychoanalysis. I wanted him to seem like a person who wants to be seen and who wants to be analyzed, but he's a bit secretive. To achieve this, I added something new to his design, which were some barbed wires around his arms. I did this to reference the fact that Surrealism started after the First World War, and the ruins behind him were to reference the fact that he started out after a tragedy. And its existence is basically an attempt to try and lift society up after it. In the book I read, it explained that a lot of Surrealism depicted violence for this reason, or at least a hint of violence, at least. People were trying to understand themselves after a horrible war shook everything they thought they knew about themselves and what they knew about other people. I also wanted him to be isolated, since a lot of surrealist art, to get into that dreamlike state, a lot of paintings look as if they were photographed in the middle of nowhere. This might be because when we dream, we're usually alone, or at least dreams are personal to each person. So it might feel as if we're the only people they really exist in our dreams. I don't know. I'm not the best person to explain it, but that could also be why when a liminal space has no people in it, it seems like a dream. But as soon as you put people in it, it suddenly feels real. Because, the people around you have an individual life of their own outside yours, maybe? I don't know, I'm not like a psychoanalyst, so I'm not great with my words. But yeah, that's what I had in mind. And a bonus fact, Freud himself didn't like the surrealism art movement, which I think is kind of funny. I think he told like Andre Breton, or was it Salvador Dali, I don't remember, but one of them went to see him in Germany, and I don't really know what he said exactly. I think he just said like, he just wasn't impressed with the idea, which is weird because it was based off of his idea of psychoanalysis.
And those are all the art movement characters I designed. I'll put a comparison on screen from 2023 and the one from 2025. I think I learned a lot about art history and just how much art has evolved throughout the years. It seems like art movements were always a response to something. Baroque wanted to push back against the Protestant Reformation. Pop art, surrealism, constructivism, and even ukiyo-e, were responses to the changing state of the world and the aftermath of violent wars. Art it just seems like a very responsive thing. It's very human, and it's very societal. Art is meant to be personal, but it's also meant to be accessible, and I think that's pretty cool. There were some other art movements I wanted to do. I wanted to do like Fauvism, Rococo, German Impressionism, even a bit of like Eastern Roman tiled art. But I'll have to get to them like next time. But for now, here are the ones I have. Just a nice little group of gay little art kids. Yeah, I'm not kidding. That's what they're called in my folder, like my Procreate folder for like the longest time. My gay little art kids. I mean, to me, that makes sense. I don't believe a single MF in this lineup is a hetero. But anyways, I hope this video was cool. I hope it was informative. Hopefully, maybe see you around. I don't really know what to say. If they had like a sixth orgy, we'd probably make like a killer ass painting. Like maybe they make a new art movement. Okay, I'm done. I don't know how to end.